how the ANZACS helped the miracle at Dunkirk, or the world's greatest forgotten armada. This bizarre history of Australian story is brought to you by Time Safari's Rockhampton walking tours and school incursions. Join us on our walks around historic Rockhampton as we chat about the bushrangers, bank heists, murders, ghosts, and if the real Jack the Ripper once stalked the city's alleys. If you're a teacher, please contact us about our school visit activities. All information is available through our website, linked below. True monsters once plied the world's oceans, and on the 1st of May 1940, one of these departed New Zealand to meet several such behemoths of the sea. Now in 1939, Germany was once again rampaging through the nations of Europe. Poland had fallen, as had Czechoslovakia, and it looked like France was next. Thanks to a spiderweb of treaties with many of these endangered countries, England once more found itself declaring war on Germany. And despite all those old newsreels warning that London now stood alone, this was far from true, as the nations of the Commonwealth answered her call for help. This led to the almost forgotten story of when the armies of Australia and New Zealand briefly reformed the world-famous ANZACS and marched, well, sailed, in astonishing luxury as it turns out, off to war. In less than a year, Hitler's forces had already marched throughout Europe, and of serious concern, not only had Russia joined in the Nazi attack on Poland, the great red nation of the north had turned its eye on its longtime enemy, Sweden. With nation after nation now falling, and France seemingly in danger, you can understand England's growing feeling of isolation. But the Commonwealth was rallying. The problem was, just how were they going to get there? Europe was thousands of miles away, with the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans separating London from most of its manpower. And all of these oceans were patrolled by hungry wolves, like Germany's growing fleet of astonishingly effective submarines, the notorious U-boats. What was needed was a convoy of large ships to sneak into the South Seas, pick up the Anzac army preparing to fight, and carry them to Europe. Luckily, there just happened to be a few of these ships lying around, and they were perfect for this purpose. These ships were lovingly known as the Monsters. At the time, the second largest ship in the world, the luxury liner Queen Mary, had docked in New York at the start of the war for protection. Germany's Kriegsmarine seemed to be everywhere. Her battleships were fast and powerful. Her U-boats seemed to be hiding beneath every wave. The world's greatest fleet of luxury liners were clearly vulnerable, but luckily just a short cruise across the Atlantic sat the neutral port of New York, the perfect place for these vessels to wait out the war. However, a secret plan was hatched to put these great monsters to work. In supposed secret, the New York docks began work on these ocean liners to convert them to troop transports. Many of the most famous cruise ships in the world, the Queen Mary, the Queen Elizabeth, the Mauretania, had some of their finery removed, while outside the hulls and numerous port windows were painted over. By the time the New York cruise were done, the Queen Mary herself had a new name, the Grey Ghost. Secret orders were then issued that England's greatest ocean liners were to set sail without issuing a port of arrival. Across the world, ocean liners like Aquitania and the Andes, along with the Canadian Pacific steamships Empress of Britain and Empress of Japan, sailed from the ports where they'd been anchored and began cruising south at top speed. At the same time, a lot of people were noticing things were happening in New York Harbour. On the 1st of April 1940, Life magazine carried the title, "Queen Mary and Mauretania leave New York moorings for unknown destination." 2 hours after sundown on the evening of March 20th, the Mauretania backed out into the Hudson and, pushing her grey nose into spring's first thunderstorm, slid darkly down the bay and out to sea. 12 hours later, under a misty morning sun, the Queen Mary sped after her little sister into Atlantic limbo.
Surprising news came from the other side of the Atlantic, the sailing of the Mauretania from New York. The great liner left with destination unknown, but it had been said that she and the Queen Mary, which sailed later, were intended for service as troop ships.
Though the destination of both ships was supposed to be a secret, this didn't stop Life from speculating. It's believed both ships were destined for transport service hauling Anzac troops to the armies of the Near East. The magazine next speculated the smaller Mauretania may have left early so she could head through the Panama Canal and on into the Pacific. But the huge Queen Mary must round either Cape Horn or Cape of Good Hope because she was just far too big to pass through the canal. Turns out, Life was spot on. From across the world, the greatest cruise ships of the day sped south, reaching ports in New Zealand and across Australia to collect the first troops both nations had ready to march off to war. Now, a lot of reports say that the vessels had already gone through conversions, but this isn't quite true. As each vessel arrived, they began their own conversions into troopship duties. For the Queen Mary, she sailed through the Sydney Heads and docked near Cockatoo Island's dockyard. Now, she was far too big for any actual berth in the harbour, so everything, workers, materials and stores, had to be transported out to her anchorage. Here, many of the luxury liner's peacetime fittings were taken out for safe storage, like her expensive carpets and fine wood panelling. These are all removed, along with her very comfortable beds, so smaller bunks could be placed inside. This meant her accommodations increased from 2,140 to 5,500. It was a massive logistical exercise and was completed very, very quickly. One account suggests the cruise ship's famous white exteriors were repainted to battleship grey, but as we know, this actually did happen in New York, though other reports in Sydney Harbour pointed out that the grey had washed off around the vessel's splash zone during the travel, revealing a bit of her Cunard livery. So perhaps the repainting was to touch up these exposed locations. And we do have evidence that the Queen Mary was still a functioning luxury liner, from Kenneth Pantolin, a veteran who talked about this in 2004.
Can you tell us about your voyage on the Queen Mary?
Well, I told you it was very sudden and very impressive because she hadn't been stripped out at that time. Later on, it carried a whole division of Americans across the Atlantic. That's about 20,000 people. When we went to England, she hadn't been stripped. So had all the normal facilities. We had swimming pools and Turkish baths and nice eating conditions, and there was no hard life on board. Very few. As I said, we had very good living conditions, and the whole atmosphere was just as much as it was on the tour. The officers were in beautiful rooms, state rooms, and she wasn't stripped, you see, because later on they stripped it all and they covered in the decks and put bunks and things on the decks. Well, none of that was in place when we travelled. That was good.
What was your rank at this stage?
I was a warrant officer class 2. What they call a regimental quartermaster sergeant. I was responsible for the what would you call quartermaster duties, supplies, equipment, that sort of thing.
At the start of May, the ships Aquitania, Empress of Britain and Empress of Japan set sail with New Zealand's contingent, including a section of Maori warriors. Running alongside these vessels for protection was Her Majesty's New Zealand ship Leander and the Australian Navy's Grand Dame HMAS Canberra, along with her sister ship HMAS Australia.
The 8-inch gun cruiser HMAS Australia was the most powerful unit of the RAN when war broke out. One of her early missions in May 1940 was to escort Australian and New Zealand troops en route to Britain. The Australians were the 18th Infantry Brigade of the 6th Division with attached troops. The Atlantic speed record holder, Queen Mary, the world's second largest ship, sailed from New York to Sydney to embark them. "8,000 Australian troops boarded Queen Mary, Mauretania and Empress of Canada. A contingent of the Royal Australian Air Force travelled with them. Once the troops were aboard, they were the responsibility of the Navy. It was the Navy's job to escort them on their perilous voyage halfway across the world to reinforce embattled Britain. It was upon the Navy that they relied for protection against the submarines lying in wait along the sea lanes, against fast German pocket battleships and other surface raiders, and against air attack.
Off Sydney on the 5th of May, this flotilla was joined by the Mauretania and the Queen Mary, now officially renamed Transport 11. The entire fleet was given the codename Convoy US-3, and immediately they did not head north, but instead started sailing south. As they slipped through the Bass Strait between Tasmania and the state of Victoria, they were joined by the Empress of Canada out of Melbourne, carrying even more troops, and yet another Australian cruiser, HMAS Adelaide. Between them, the 7 ships transported around 14 to 18,000 men. 3 times their peacetime passenger numbers. Many years later, the Australian veteran Lawrence Calder was asked about this time on these ships.
Yeah, I take you're on board. Is it right, the Empress of Canada? Is that right?
Yes.
Could you describe for me the accommodation?
The accommodation was excellent then. What they'd done is that all of the cabins they'd converted into double decks. If you had a 2-berth cabin, it became a 4-berth cabin. And that's how we were accommodated. We believe, I'm not certain of this, but we believe the officers still had the original accommodation up top, which was natural.
That's right, these soldiers were going to war in absolute luxury on board some of the world's greatest ever ocean liners. Now in the press, this fleet was being called the world's greatest armada, and thus began one of the most audacious convoys of the war. The fleet first set sail for Fremantle, Western Australia, for resupply and to receive their final orders. Fremantle placed the fleet closer to Europe, as the decision for which route the convoy should take had still not been finalised. The plan originally was to sail through the Suez Canal, then on through the Mediterranean and then to England. But as Convoy US-3 first set sail from Melbourne, there were rumblings fascist Italy was about to enter the war and side with Germany. Now with a sizable navy, if this occurred, the Italians would make sailing through the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean fatal. Mussolini was a man Hitler looked up to, and he was determined both nations would join together. And it looked like he was finally getting his wish, as both European nations were becoming allies. Now if this wasn't bad enough, things became drastic however when news arrived on the very day the fleet reached Fremantle that the German army had finally attacked France. By the time the convoy was sailing across the Indian Ocean, Germany was now pushing deep into France, Holland and Belgium, with a vast amount of the British army on the continent attempting to slow them down. What the Allies needed urgently was help. However, with no new reports about Italy, the convoy still headed north to Sri Lanka. Then the plan was onto the Suez. During this leg of the voyage, the first vessel to leave the fleet was the Leander, which was soon followed by HMAS Canberra, which left, I have to say, with a spectacular flourish. The pride of the Australian fleet built up a head of steam, pulled ahead of the convoy, turned around and then, with flags flying and sirens blaring, charged right down the middle of the fleet, saluting the troops who poured to the sides of their ships to watch and wave their thanks to this powerful warship. The Canberra was soon replaced by the HMS Shropshire. Tragically, this would not be the last time this happened, because just a few years later, HMS Canberra would be sunk during the Battle of Salvo Island. And in response, the British would send a replacement to the Australian Navy for the Canberra, the HMS Shropshire. On the 15th of May 1940, the fleet was forced to change direction from its original destination of the Middle East, as word came in they were now at war with Italy as well. Instead, Convoy US-3 was ordered to sail south again, this time to Cape Town, then on past the west coast of Africa to England. Going back to that interview with Kenneth Pantlin, he did note about this change in direction.
The only thing that they did run a bit short on, to a degree, was food, because she was almost up the Red Sea before Italy was coming into the war and causing trouble around the area in the Red Sea area, and they wouldn't risk these big ships up there, so they had to divert us around to Cape Town. So food was getting a little bit tight, and they replenished it in Cape Town.
Even entering the friendly waters of South Africa, vigilance could not be relaxed. Cape Town was the convoy's first port of call since leaving Fremantle. It had been reached without incident or loss. There, HMAS Australia handed over her escort duties to British warships, which took the convoy on to its final anchorage in the Clyde.
Now, the ANZAC arrival in South Africa is truly epic, bordering on mythological, and easily would take up an entire episode. Thus, the video is part 1, As part 2, we will return to what happened when the ANZACS arrived in Cape Town. And trust me, that will be worth the wait. For example, the very first thing I found in my research was the Prime Minister of South Africa standing up for the ANZACS who just visited his town. They'd been given a few days' leave to get off the ships and stretch their legs. Let's just say these troops threw themselves one of the greatest parties humanity has ever witnessed. When answering a question in the South African Assembly, the Prime Minister stated that he denied that Australian troops en route to England were guilty of scandalous conduct in Cape Town. He gave an emphatic no to the suggestion that no Australians should be allowed to land at Union ports or on that government should investigate the wrongdoings by the visiting troops. And as for the one serious charge, well, he explained, the Australians did not use dynamite. Wait, what? What dynamite? We have to go back and investigate this story. But as I said, we will get to it in part 2. Now, back in London, the government was growing concerned as the war was not going well. Most of the British Army was fighting Germany and France, leaving the nation somewhat empty of troops if things went wrong with the defence of their neighbour across the Channel. By the time the convoy set sail from Africa, this is exactly what had happened. Germany had breached all of France's defences, effectively cutting the British off, who'd begun to retreat to a small port on the French coast called Dunkirk. With the entire British Army apparently about to be surrounded and decimated, or at the very least captured, Commonwealth troops like the ANZACS were now at a premium, and the fleet was tasked with sailing on to England. 18,000 ANZACS would prove very useful, especially after the reputation the men from down under had earned during the First World War. If there was any force that could put some doubt in the minds of the German High Command about invading the apparently exposed England coastline, it was the ANZACS. Now, I should point out, as Convoy US-3 sailed between Cape Town and Sierra Leone, they did manage to lose an entire cruise ship. The Empress of Japan still had most of her peacetime staff on board, including a large number of Chinese stewards, who took umbrage serving soldiers who they believed were of a very low rank. They also didn't like the fact that many officers of these soldiers had their own batmen, who often did things like fetching tea, a job the stewards believed was theirs. To defeat the batmen, the Chinese workers organised to have tea delivered just a few minutes before the scheduled time the officers had ordered it, and so cutting the batman completely out of this job. The batman in turn fought back by making the tea even earlier, thus cutting the stewards out. Things became so ridiculous when some officers who'd asked for a tea at 7 a.m. in the morning found themselves being awoken at 5:30 by a steward or a batman delivering their beverage. The Chinese also began to ask for double their normal pay as they were about to enter a war zone. To combat all of this, the Empress of Japan was ordered home, with all Chinese stewards from the entire fleet dumped on board. The troops she had been carrying were then spread out amongst the remaining transports. As the fleet was sailing along the coast of Africa, the Aquitania suddenly veered right and swung directly behind the Empress of Canada, with Andes and Mauritania immediately taking action to avoid any sort of collision. Aquitania was soon flying flags alerting everyone about she was no longer under any sort of control. It took a few hours, but her steering was finally repaired and everyone was back up to full speed. Now, the thought of these overstuffed cruise ships hitting each other and sinking with all hands just does not bear thinking about. Now, from West Africa, the fleet was ordered on to Scotland, but few of them knew that a squadron of warships was steaming towards them. To escort the ANZACS the rest of the way, the pride of the Royal Navy, HMS Hood, with an escort of Canadian destroyers, Broke, Restigouche, St. Laurent and Skeena were on their way. Now, if you need any evidence just how desperate London was for the ANZACS to arrive and help defend the country, this escort was soon further strengthened by the aircraft carriers HMS Hermes and the HMS Argus. Now, it should be pointed out, with this many ANZACS on board, you are always going to have yourself some good-natured humour. At one point, a young officer managed to talk a pretty young nurse to go out for a midnight stroll with him along the ship's deck. He soon had the nurse snuggled up against the railing, with both of them looking across the passing dark ocean, reflecting the moon high above. The soldier turned to the nurse and said, "Well, just look at that. It's just you, me, the sea, and that amazing moon." "And me," said the soldier standing guard behind them in the dark that both lovers had completely missed. One item in the funny in a not really kind of funny way was the Empress of Canada, that proved to be so short-staffed that ANZACS were asked to take over numerous roles on the ship. This left her inexperienced crew to do more of their technical jobs like steer the actual ship. This, of course, was of some concern, so the Admiral of the fleet ensured that the Empress was left at the very far end of the column, thus giving her plenty of room to make any mistakes without causing a catastrophe. Since rounding Africa, the now zigzagging Armada was 300 miles off the coast of Spain, when they were further joined by the cruisers Dorsetshire and Cumberland, along with the destroyers Warwick and Witch. Finally, the convoy arrived in the Clyde on the 16th of June, nearly 6 weeks after many of these men had been put on these boats, and convoy US-3 would become the largest convoy to ever arrive in this river during the war, and they had done this without ever being spotted by an Italian or a German warship. Now, it took several days to remove all the troops, ferry them ashore and get them onto the trains. The soldiers were then moved on to Edinburgh, then south into England, and finally to the Salisbury Plains in Wiltshire. Bizarrely, this is the very region so many of their fathers had spent time in during the First World War, when the first batch of ANZACS in England had camped in the exact same spot.
Port up there, and we disembarked, travelled by train down to Salisbury Plains to a place called Tidworth. We were under tents and camps there. Tidworth is or was, I suppose it still is, what they call a military town, a garrison town, where soldiers have been there throughout ages, and a lot of training for troops. So we were in tents there, and got us stirred up a few times. We said after we arrived in the air, get the air alarms and a few bombs that dropped. It was all new to us. Hadn't struck this sort of thing before. You'd get an alarm and go, you'd dive into a trench and hear some bombs thud somewhere, and then you'd get clear and go back, and this might go 3-4 times a night. It was all new. But we were down there for, I remember, there'd be 5 months, and the whole division was moved to Colchester, adopted a role of defence in that area, which is East Anglia. And that's a garrison town too, Colchester. So we were in houses there. That was very good. It was nice accommodation. We were there over Christmas, and we left in February back to the Middle East.
In fact, today the chalk hills of Wiltshire sport the map of Australia, and had once had the rising sun emblem of the AIF carved into the very hills by these same troops. When the soldiers of the Second World War arrived, though, these features were missing, as the grass had been allowed to grow over these cuttings, as they potentially could have been used as landmarks by German bomber crews. Most of them, however, have been replaced today. Now, when the ANZACS arrived, the weather was grim and grey, and the mood of the nation reflected this. News had arrived that Holland had fallen, as had Belgium. France had been cut in two, and Paris was seemingly hours away from signing surrender. In part 3, we will take a look at how this huge injection of eager and humorous ANZAC soldiers helped break this depressed mood of England, and how many locals began to feel safer and even smile as the Australian and New Zealanders started to filter out into their everyday life, bringing joy and confidence with them. Things were looking bleak, but not to worry, old chum. The Aussies are here to give old Hitler a kick in the groin. Though few of these troops would stay for long, this forgotten episode in Australia's Second World War exploits should be remembered for its importance to the war effort. For now, this force of ANZACS were in a position to protect England from invasion, allowing the British Army and Royal Navy to concentrate on rebuilding and rearming after the Dunkirk evacuations. And evidence of just how important these troops were was the German reaction to the convoy. Just like Life magazine, Berlin had worked out what the world's largest ships were up to, and knew an ANZAC army would soon be sailing for Europe. A U-boat wolf pack, one of the very first of the war, had been sent to find the fleet and hunt them off the west of Spain. Rosing's wolf pack, named after experienced naval commander Hans Rudolf Rosing, had contained some of the most famous U-boats of the war, like U-43, U-101, 48, 46, and U-29, responsible for sinking the aircraft carrier HMS Courageous on the 17th of September 1939. This was the first British warship sunk during the war by the enemy. Luckily, one of the numerous changes of directions the convoy had undergone meant they had slipped past this trap. So in that sense, the Rosing wolf pack had failed. Yet during this patrol, the 7 U-boats sank 27 Allied vessels, leading to some reports that one vessel from convoy US-3 had fallen behind and been torpedoed. This wasn't true. The British steam merchant Balmoralwood was indeed sunk in the region by a U-boat at the time, and was the probable source of this story, as the entire fleet had arrived in the UK. Well, other than, as we know, the Empress of Japan, which would soon be renamed the Empress of Scotland when Japan also allied itself with the Axis powers. Now, once all the ANZACS had been disembarked, this fleet got back to work. The warships either took up patrols or cruised alongside the ocean liners that were now employed to ferry British troops to various locations across the world. Some even headed back to pick up more ANZACS. And as for the mighty Grey Ghost, well, during her World War II career, the Queen Mary travelled over 600,000 miles and carried nearly 1 million troops to destinations across the planet. Canadians, Americans, English and Australians and Kiwis and Indians. She would survive the war, partly because of her great speed. This is why ocean liners were chosen, not cruise ships. Cruise ships were designed to just cruise around, show you the sights in comfort. Ocean liners at the time were the way to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible in hopefully as much luxury as possible, and they were amongst the fastest ships in the world. All of these monsters were monsters in name only. Very few of them had any armour, few weapons. Their one and only defence was their incredible speed. It was hoped the Queen Mary, the Mauretania, could simply outpace any other vessel trying to catch them. And this proved to be the case because most of these vessels continued throughout the war ferrying troops, and almost all of them survived. And as for the Queen Mary, well, she had a few more decades of service before she was retired. And today you can actually visit the Grey Ghost at her moorings in Florida. So there you go, I hope you enjoyed that. How the ANZACS honestly did help out the evacuation of Dunkirk and then headed out to their most famous feats in Africa, Papua New Guinea and the rest of the world. It's an important story and one that really has not been told that often. Now, if you enjoyed that, I hope you like and subscribe. And also, if you're coming to Rockhampton, why not take one of our Time Safaris tours? Honestly, you're going to have a great time and learn some amazing stuff. And that's it for me. Thanks very much, and I'll talk to you next time.